You've been cordially invited to another episode of I'll Tell You What, the podcast that's all love Black history. I'll Tell You What is presented by Hueido, and I'm Ashley, your favorite raconteuse that can't wait to tell you these love stories every single Monday. So please don't forget to subscribe on the Tube of You or wherever you get your podcasts. And also, follow us everywhere you can, and if you really love I'll Tell You What and want to support us, please join us on the Treon of Pay. And know you can send any comments or questions you may have to I'llTellYouWhat.com. Now, it's the month we've all been waiting for. Happy Black History Month. This month, we're purposely going to reflect on the couples we frequently associate with Black excellence. So to start the month, we are going to discuss Robert Nesta Marley and his marriage to Alpharetta Constantia Anderson. But we know them as Bob and Rita Marley. Now, Bob and Rita's marriage was a union joined together through their shared passion for music. After getting married in the 1960s while they were both very, very young, they navigated the challenges of a relationship marked by the demands and cravings of Bob's burgeoning music career. Now, with financial struggles, many infidelities, the babies on babies on babies, political controversy, and illness, their marriage wasn't necessarily easy, and at times it make you want to ask yourself, is this love? Now, if you can't tell, there is so much to their love story, and y'all, I can't wait to tell you all about it. So, let me tell you just how Bob Marley met his wife, Rita. It's an interesting story, to say the least. Now, this was the 1960s. Bob was a member of the singing group The Wailing Wailers, and allegedly the father of a daughter named Amani Carroll from a previous relationship. Rita was a 17-year-old mom to a baby girl named Sharon. Her boyfriend, who was also the father of the child, was sent to England when his mom learned that he got Rita pregnant. In her biography, Rita said she'd see the Wailers walk by her house on their way to the studio and suggested that her trio, the Soulettes, which comprised of her friend Marlene and Rita's cousin Dream, post up and sing and wave when they saw them passing by in hopes of possibly one day getting put on. Now, eventually it worked, and one of the Wailers, a guy named Peter, walked over, as well as Bob and the rest of them. She said Peter asked her to come to the studio to audition. Nice enough, right? Well, one of the founding members of the Wailers, a woman named Beverly Kelso, said that's not what happened at all. She said Rita would, quote, stand by her gate with her baby in her hand, and she used to wave to us and Bob. She also said that the rest of the Wailers would not smile and wave, but actually make fun of Rita. Beverly said they'd, quote, bust out laughing and even call her, quote, ugly black girl and, quote, monkey. Beverly, being the only woman in the Wailers, hated that so much that she started being nice to Rita on purpose. She also said she was the one that asked Rita and her crew to sing, which resulted in them being invited to the studio. Beverly said that both Peter and Bob wanted to date Rita, which meant, quote, she wasn't the black ugly girl no more, which I don't know how you go from calling someone names to wanting to be with them, but I guess catcalling in all forms really hasn't changed too much over the years. But again, this is all allegedly, according to Beverly. But it became very obvious that Rita was more interested in Bob than Peter, and if the incident Beverly mentioned holds true, it makes sense. So, trigger warning. But Beverly recalled a moment where she saw Peter try to force himself on Rita, again, allegedly. None of the other Wailers were aware of this incident, nor did Rita know that Beverly even saw this encounter. Rita continued to come to the studio and work with the Wailers, which is where her feelings for Bob began to evolve. One of Bob's childhood friends felt like Rita was always interested in Bob. But obviously, despite the truth of how they became aware of the other, it was mutual and their storied relationship would shortly begin. things Bob Marley and Rita Anderson learned about each other as they began to date. So Rita learned that Bob was very interested in not only her well-being, but her daughters. She said, quote, "People have asked me since then whether or not I had to choose between being with Sharon or being with Bob, but I didn't really have to make that choice. He would make sure that Rita wasn't staying in the studio too late so she could be home to nurse or just be with her daughter, who was normally watched by her auntie when she was away." Bob learned that Rita was still entertaining her baby daddy, and he did not like that, not one bit. He threw away a letter that her cousin was supposed to mail out on her behalf, and, quote, that ended their relationship. Ooh. And Rita learned that Bob was basically unhoused. His mom, Sadie, moved to Delaware after having a child with her ex-boyfriend, Taddy, a man that had a live-in girlfriend. So instead of Bob going with her, he stayed and lived with his mama's ex's girlfriend, and the ex's son, who was actually one of the Whalers, a guy named Bunny. Rita put it as, quote, Taddy's woman had been mistreating him too, because she was still carrying a feud over his mother having a baby for Taddy. So because Rita's aunt wouldn't let her stay with him, Rita decided, I'm gonna go sleep on the floor of the recording studio with my man. So with all that learning about each other, I suppose somewhere in there they found out that they liked each other, and they liked what they found out because Bob and Rita then decided to take their relationship to the next level, and dun, they decided to get married. So after knowing each other for maybe a year, Bob Marley married Rita Anderson on February 10th, 1966. She was 19 and he had just turned 21. Now, before you start with the let me explain. Rita said the decision for them to get married was done, quote, on impulse. Bob's mama, City, had called for her son to join her in Delaware, and honestly, Bob was afraid that Rita would go and move on and start dating another guy while he was in the United States, so that's why he wanted to go ahead and get married. Romantic, isn't it? But you know, I can't wait to tell you all about the wedding details, because as much of a, well, I don't want to call this a sham because it definitely wasn't, but an unconventional route to commitment that this whole thing was. They really pulled together a wedding of sorts. Quote, Bob had on a black suit and fancy shoes that Coxone, his music producer, had bought for him, and I wore a borrowed mother-of-the-pearl tiara and a ruffled white dress cut just below the knee with a short lace veil, both made by Auntie, Rita recalled. Then they went to the courthouse, and afterwards, quote, Auntie cooked curry goat and rice with green bananas and made what we call a three-sister cake. But honestly, Rita said, quote, though we were well in love, we hadn't even talked about getting married until this happened. Which is probably why Bob's friends mentioned that they had no idea about the wedding until it was going on or after it even taken place. Bunny Whaler, his stepbrother kinda sorta that I was telling y'all about, said, quote, every Whaler had made a pledge not to get married until he could afford to or never. So when Bob got married, he broke a rule of the Whalers. Bunny also went on to say, quote, his mother didn't even have knowledge of it either, as if that were alluding to their marriage being a joke. Now, folks also speculated that Rita was pregnant and that was the real reason they got married. However, even though that might have been the case, more children wouldn't actually start to enter the picture for them until the following year. So after Bob and Rita's very impromptu wedding, they embarked upon a marriage that was riddled with plenty of challenges. Now, when looking back, this is how Rita described it in her biography about their life together. Quote, the husband-wife thing seemed to be an unbreakable bond. You're bound to this relationship. You never think about getting out of it. I never anticipated most of the things that happened because when I I was married like most 19-year-old girls. I thought we were just going to be this way. Love and happiness always. Her thoughts were very naive, as many young in love are. Now, early in their marriage, they spent the first 8 months separated. Bob was about 1,500 miles away in Delaware, and Rita was in Trenchtown. Now that I think about it, they spent a lot of time apart in those earlier years of their marriage. I mean, honestly, kind of throughout their whole marriage, but yeah, definitely in those earlier years. They had some financial difficulties that put an added weight not only on Bob, but on Rita as well. One time, Rita moved to Delaware and lived with Bob's mom and their youngest son to try to make some money to send back home, since Bob's career was starting to take off, but yet money was still inconsistent. And it didn't help that it felt like at one point, every time they turned around, Rita was pregnant again. Now, their first child together, Cedella, named after his mom, was born about 9 months after he returned from Delaware. And then a few months after she was born, Rita was pregnant again with their son, Ziggy. Now, with the birth of Ziggy, Rita wrote, quote, "He couldn't stop smiling and he was so proud. All night you could hear him telling his friends, 'I have a son, man, I have a son, a boy, a boy, a boy.'" Now, that did mark a happier time in their marriage. Another good time was when their entire family traveled to Delaware to see Bob's mom. And did you know that when his mom looked at Rita, she was so surprised by her looks? Rita said, quote, "She couldn't believe her eyes when she took a good look at me. She said because I looked exactly like her when she was young." And then this also gave Rita more context into possibly why Bob was drawn to her in the first place. Maybe he was looking for a replacement after she left him and went to America. And when he saw me resembling her so much and yet as ambitious as he himself was, he might have thought, this is what I need. This is my girl. But during the same trip to the United States, the reality of being married to a rising star became very apparent. As Bob's career was starting to take off, quote, "It was a record company recommendation that you shouldn't let your fans know you were married." Now, we've heard of that, right? I mean, I think we've evolved past that in a lot of regards, but still some go by that rule. I mean, think about it. We're all aware of the relationship of Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. I know. All right. To bring it a little bit closer to home, Joey Badass and Soraya. You know, being young and in love doesn't really impact the sales in the way they used to. So, because Rita did sing backup occasionally for him and she was in her own group, when asked, Bob said that Rita was not his wife, but his sister. Ah, yes, the good old "that's my sister" routine. Well, when trying to rationalize this to Rita, she said that he told her, quote, "Who wants to expose you? You're mine." And then they started to make out. Rita said, quote, "From then on, I felt all right, reassured, and very special." But over time, Rita's feelings in her marriage would become very, very complicated. Around the end of the summer of 1971, Rita was pregnant again with their fourth child. This is when Rita moved to Delaware, and as a Rastafarian, they didn't believe in birth control, so I mean, this was really their only solution. So while Rita was in the United States, Bob was entertaining at least 2 different women and got them both pregnant. So when Rita had their son, Stephen, on April 20th, 1972, about a month later, on May 16th, Bob became a father again to a boy that was named after him. And then 3 days after that, Bob had another son named Rohan. When Rita learned of this, she wrote, quote, "So even though I was in so much pain, I said, no, he's still my husband and I don't want to lose my husband." Bob's former whaler mate, Beverly, said that once she was walking with Rita and one of the other baby mamas pulled up and wanted, quote, "to fight Rita." Now why? Girl, I don't know. Beverly also said, quote, "Rita didn't know her. Rita didn't know anything." So in her defense, Beverly basically said she starts to fight this pregnant girl. Beverly said, quote, "I was pissed over the whole situation to see that he didn't want Rita. He used to treat Rita so bad." Can you imagine just walking down the street and then a pregnant girl just like rolls up and tries to like beat you into the ground? But y'all, that was just the beginning. I mean, the following year in 1973, Bob had started dating an actress, photographer, filmmaker lady named Esther Anderson. She did a movie with Sidney Poitier, so you might have heard of her. According to Bunny Wailer, quote, Bob stayed around the corner with Esther in her flat until record producer Chris Blackwell gave Bob the keys to 56 Hope Road. This work-live-play complex, essentially. Rita didn't want to move there with the kids as she felt like that scene wasn't appropriate for families. So with Bob's help, she moved to the projects in Bull Bay. Now, Rita recalled this moment when she stopped by Hope Road and wanted to see Bob. Esther was there and asked her why. Rita, sensing the attitude, was like, quote, please wake him up for me, it's important. Esther told her to, quote, leave him alone, in which Rita responded with, quote, who do you think you're talking to? Then Esther said, quote, why don't you stop breeding? All you do is breed. Their loud back and forth woke Bob up, who tried to turn this back on Rita for, quote, trying to cause a scene. Rita said she cussed them both out, got in the car, and went home. Now, that was one of the many incidents in their marriage. Rita wrote, quote, though Bob and I remained married for the rest of his life, Esther Anderson wasn't the first and wouldn't be the last woman he was involved with. Another girlfriend Bob had while he was still married to Rita was a very young Canadian-Jamaican beauty queen named Cindy Breakspear. They began to date likely around the early or at least by the mid-1970s when she lived at Hope Road with her brother. She won Miss World in 1976 and Bob frequently spent time with her at her home in England. Cindy described the earlier points in their relationship as something she was very cautious and intentional about. Quote, I knew from the first time that I ever spoke with him at length that a deep relationship would change my life permanently. This point of his life is when Bob's career began to really take off, but those that knew him for years felt like everything was changing around him, as the crowd around him was too. Beverly said when she stopped by his house, quote, it was all white people. I couldn't go inside to see Bob anymore. Biographer Roger Steffens wrote about her that, quote, Cindy proved to be gifted with a lightness of being that was at once charming and compelling in its frankness. Many of Bob's closest friends insist that she was the great love of his life. After the shooting before the Smile Jamaica concert that left both Bob and Rita with gunshot wounds, Bob went to England to stay with Cindy. And later, in 1978, Cindy would give birth to their only child, a son named Damien. Now, Rita recalled there were times when she nor her kids knew where Bob was. She was used to Bob's coming and going. She wrote, quote, I felt that I was being taken for a ride and it seemed like it was going to be a long ride, so I decided I wasn't going to play the game. After Rita moved to Bull Bay, she became really good friends with a former Jamaican soccer player turned accountant named Owen Tacky Stewart. She said, quote, he was one of those who felt very sympathetic toward me because of the way Bob was treating me. Tacky was the kind of guy to help around the house and also be the emotional and physical support that Rita missed and perhaps needed, if you know what I mean. If you know what I mean. So, I really don't have to tell you that Mr. Robert Nesta Marley was big mad about it. You know he was. Now, Rita mentioned one time Bob came to her house and was yelling at Tacky saying, quote, you're seeing my woman. According to her, Tacky went to him as a man and said, quote, we can't fight, we're brethren, and I'm here because she needs help and you must respect that. Rita didn't take the high road, however, and wanted to know why did Bob bring all this energy to her house when he literally drove over here with some broad in the car. Over time, the relationship between Rita and Tacky actually grew. Quote, eventually I found myself attracted to him as well as grateful for his attention, and we developed a relationship that I thought was normal. That relationship would birth two daughters, Stephanie, born in 1974, and Sarita, born in 1985. This era of Bob and Rita's marriage signaled the true evolution in their relationship, one that many wouldn't understand, but served them through the rest of Bob's life. Bob and Rita Marley's marriage was very unconventional, but when you think about it, they went through all 7 stages of love instead of just one, love. Early in their career, they had a ludus love, which is playful and flirtatious. This evolved into eros, which is, the romantic, passionate love. Rita mentioned while rehearsing, they would be, quote, looking into each other's eyes and singing, and then we put our mouths to each other's, and I'm thinking, is this love? As they began to have kids, it grew to a philia love, which is a friendly kind of love. And that's when their relationship began to change as Bob's extramarital relationships became more apparent. Bob dated photographer actress Esther Anderson and then former Miss World Cindy Breakspear, among others. Then Rita came to terms with her reality. She said, quote, I didn't think I should disrupt his relationships, though sometimes the situation was painful and I couldn't understand what was going on. But I got tired of standing in the way, and as long as I was respected, given whatever I needed financially, and whatever the kids needed was there, I let him be. And though Bob didn't want her to move on like he had, but she did anyway, Rita felt like their marriage had changed to her being, quote, Rita the friend, or, quote, Rita the sister. That's when their storge, or familial love, began. Also, a pragma love, which is basically a realistic and committed kind of love. Rita really wanted to create the best life for her kids and truly believed Bob felt the same way. And though he had at least 6 kids outside of his marriage to Rita, Rita said she frequently cared for those children as if they were her own too. Now, these babies aren't responsible for the lives they're born into, and Rita recognized that. Throughout Bob's career, especially early on, Rita held a maternal role. So as Bob's melanoma was diagnosed and then progressed, Rita would alternate as his caregiver along with Cindy Breakspear, who she later became cool with. And this is where the agape and restricted love came on real strong. After he passed away, Rita carried on to establish his estate and preserve his legacy through countless lawsuits, concerts, media, and more. She refused to let the legend of Bob Marley die, though his flesh did. And not only that, Rita wanted to remain true to herself too. Like, that's one thing I really noticed in reading about them, that Rita didn't want to just be Bob's wife or the mother of Bob's kids, but maintain her independence. She said through it all, she, quote, still felt like Rita. I never gave up on me fully, never forgot me, and absorbed everything. In addition to continuing to extend the Marley brand, she rekindled a relationship with Tacky that produced her last child, Sarita, in 1985. Through the years, she also farmed, opened a restaurant, pursued her musical career, and found ways to prioritize herself. And this is where Rita actually experienced the erotic love, or self-love. But let's go back to 1966, when on a whim, these two kids decided to get married, and who knew the storied life that would be ahead of them? Then they were just two kids that loved to sing and create music, and through the good times and bad, they end up creating so much more. And y'all, Owl Runners, that concludes the love story of Bob and Rita Marley. So what did you think about Bob and Rita's love story? As you know, don't forget to follow, subscribe everywhere, head to I'llTellYouWhat.com for anything you need, and definitely join the Triana Pay. But I hope to see all of you next week in the pews for yet another Black love story.
Here's what I say.